Hey, this is Kip, and in this video series, we're learning how to fly the VisionJet in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. This is part 2, where we're going to learn to use vertical navigation, or VNAV, to descend, and take advantage of the G3000 feature called Visual Approaches, which will actually let us line up with any runway in the entire world. And finally, I'll land the VisionJet over some very inconveniently placed trees. One of the G3000 map settings that I use all the time is called Inset window, and you can turn it on by going here to Map Settings, then click Inset window, and turn on this option right here called Flight Plan Text. This will show our flight plan right below the map at the bottom of our MFD. And if you turn on the full screen map, then you'll see it also adds a Current VNAV Profile section to the bottom right. I'll be referencing this a lot when we plan our descent and use vertical navigation. When you do a mission in career mode, it'll automatically determine your flight plan for you, and in most cases, it'll be pre-programmed into your avionics. Here you can see we have a bunch of en route waypoints landing on runway 21. If I go to the MFD down here and click on flight plan, I can review each of these waypoints one at a time. You can click the down button over here to scroll through them. And then you can see after this waypoint corn, it goes directly to our destination, runway 21. If your flight plan has an approach chosen for you automatically, you will see it say VTF, or Vectors to Final, and then the name of the approach. In the later videos in this series, I will cover how to do an RNAV approach and an ILS approach, but in this case, I'm going to use the visual approaches once we get into cruise. And if you happen to have a flight plan or a mission that is asking you to do an ILS or an RNAV approach, you can still reprogram it to use these visual approaches that exist in the G3000. Keep in mind that these visual approaches, as the name suggests, are meant to be used only when you're flying in visual conditions, meaning you can see where you're going down to the runway. To add an approach to our flight plan, we can do it two different ways, either by clicking our destination here from the flight plan and then clicking Select Approach. Or if you go back to the MFD home screen, you can click the Proc or Procedures button and then just click on this third row right here that says Approach. And now we're on the Approach selection screen. You can see it's automatically selected our destination airport and pre-selected the visual for runway 21. Next, we're going to click the Transition button and choose the only other option here besides vectors, which is straight. This is going to generate a couple waypoints here. The first one's called straight, the next one's called final, and then the third here we can see the threshold of runway 21. Now all I have to do is hit the load button at the bottom of the screen to load the approach into the flight plan. The button next to it called Load and Activate does the same thing, except it will automatically take our GPS and activate the first waypoint in the sequence here called straight. I'm in my en route phase of the flight, and I have a bunch of waypoints I have to get to before we're ready to start the approach. So I'm not going to hit load and activate. All that activate an approach means is that it's going to sequence your GPS to go directly to the first waypoint in the approach. When we hit the load button, we'll see this warning here: obstacle clearance is not provided for visual approaches. Unlike an instrument approach like an ILS or an RNAV approach, these visual approaches do not guarantee clearance from obstacles like terrain or buildings. So we can just hit OK to acknowledge that. Whenever you load an instrument approach into your flight plan, it's going to take your destination airport and put it at the end of your en route waypoint section. So that's before the approach section here. You can see that it has 5 Kilo 6, my destination airport, before the approach. That means that if we just follow the flight plan how it is, we're going to fly over the airport and then to the approach section. The reason for this is that when we file a flight plan with ATC, it ends at the airport. The approach is actually assigned by ATC as we get near our destination. But what I want to do for this flight is just ignore ATC and delete this en route waypoint so I don't fly over the airport, then do the approach. I just want to go directly from corn to the approach. So it'll go from corn to the straight waypoint and start our approach. Now that we're in cruise and we have our approach programmed into our flight plan, let's talk about descent. Instead of using rules of thumb to calculate how much altitude we need to lose and how far out and what speed we'll descend at, all we're going to do is take advantage of a feature called vertical navigation, or VNAV. When we loaded our visual approach procedure into the G3000, it automatically calculated and assigned an altitude restriction to the waypoint right here called final. When altitude restrictions are in the flight plan, vertical navigation can be used to descend to those waypoints. It calculated 1,675 feet, so I'm going to round that up to 1,700 and use the altitude selection knob to set that target altitude. Now all I have to do is click VNAV on the autopilot to arm what's called vertical path mode. Up here in the FMA or flight mode annunciator, we see the word path in white, letting us know that vertical path mode is armed and ready to be used as soon as we hit our top of descent. We can see our top of descent over here on the MFD where it says time until top of descent with a timer counting down. If you need to climb while you're in cruise, all you have to do is go down and choose a new selected altitude. I'm going to right click to actually sync it to my current altitude, and then I'll move that up to 12,000 feet. I'm at 8,000 right now and I want to get above these clouds. Once you choose the new altitude, just hit FLC on the autopilot, and the auto throttle will throttle up to a climb mode again to get us up to that new altitude. After you're finished with the climb, don't forget to change your selected altitude down to your VNAV descent altitude again if you do want it to start the descent when we get to our top of descent marker. Sometimes I forget to do this and end up just sitting at cruise and then later realizing that I missed my top of descent. Here I've changed the selected altitude back down to 1,700, and since vertical nav was already turned on, I can see it says path there already. So again, it's set up to start that top of descent once we hit the top of descent mark. When you're doing a career mode mission, if you keep an eye on the steps in the top right, it may show you the next waypoint it expects you to fly to. And if for some reason you missed that waypoint, maybe you changed your route or went off on heading mode on your own, and you realize you need to go back to that waypoint, the quickest way to do that is just to click Flight Plan, click on the waypoint you need to go to, and then click this Direct To button, the D with an arrow through it. Then you can click Activate Direct To, and that'll result in it drawing a new course from your plane's current location to that waypoint. If you have navigation mode turned on your autopilot, it'll result in you turning towards that waypoint immediately. Besides keeping my eyes on my top of descent marker, I also have customized the fields above my map to show my total fuel endurance and my en route time until our destination. You can do that by going to the MFD Utilities and then click on Setup and then click on Avionics Settings and then click MFD Fields. And here you can click on any of the 8 pieces of data that are shown in the data bar and decide what gets shown. By default, you can see it has ground speed and estimated time en route. I'd like to point out that estimated time en route means your time to the next waypoint. If you want the time to your final destination, it's down here called ENR, ETE to final destination. That's all of the remaining legs. But you go ahead and just click any of those, use the up and down buttons to choose what you want, and just customize it to your personal preference. To prepare for the approach, we also need to know our gear and flap extension limits. If we look down here, we can see a label that says VLO extended 210 knots indicated airspeed. So when we're at or below 210 knots indicated airspeed, we can safely put the gear down. Down here, if we look at our flaps control, we can also see speeds posted right here, conveniently, for our maximum flap extension speeds. We can use 50% flaps when we're under 190 knots and 100% or full flaps when we're under 150 knots. So as long as we're under 150 knots, we can put our gear down and extend our flaps into their fully extended position. When you hear the Garmin say vertical track, that means you're 1 minute to top of descent.
Vertical track.
So we can see here our top of descent is at 57 seconds, and we can see the little TOD marker on the map, top of descent. As we approach that top of descent marker, you can see the vertical component of it over here on the vertical deviation indicator. And now vertical path mode is activating. It's turning green, and it's starting to pitch the plane down to follow that guidance down to our altitude constraint from the flight plan. You may notice that my auto throttle is holding me at a 245 knot speed limit, even though we're not able to reach that speed right now. But the reason why it says 245 and not 250 is because I went into the flight plan and then clicked VNAV and then clicked descent, and I changed my descent schedule and my altitude speed limit from 250 to 245. The reason is because career mode will give you a point deduction if you overspeed when you're under 10,000 feet. So I wanted to abide by that 10,000 foot, 250 knot speed limit. And the career mode while I'm recording this, it's just a bit sensitive there. If you hit like 250.5, it will ding you for that. So I brought it down by 5 knots to make sure that I don't get that penalty. My specific visual approach has me doing a full reversal over here to the northeast of the airport in order to line up with the runway. I'm going to go ahead and just pull my throttle back to automatically turn off auto throttle. And you can see the yellow AT flashing here to let me know that auto throttle was disengaged. If you want to clear that warning, you can bind a key to disengage auto throttle, and hitting that shortcut will clear the warning. So I'm just aiming to get my speed under 200 knots or so right now while we do this turn. I'm now slowing down a bit further to around 180 knots, and I'm going to go ahead and check our VREF speed. We can take a look over here for where it says VREF. This is calculated partially using the aircraft weight information we put in the first video. So our VREF speed, that's the speed that we'll be crossing the threshold of the runway at, and we will pull the throttle to idle and then land after that. If I look down below my compass, I can see that I'm about 4 miles away from the final waypoint. When we get to the final waypoint, we'll have 2.5 miles until the runway. Over here on the vertical deviation indicator, there's now a new symbol that's a little gray outlined diamond, and that represents our vertical guidance. If we click approach on the autopilot, that will arm a mode called glide path, and it will follow that vertical guidance when it's available to descend us further towards the runway. But since we're using the visual approach feature, this is known as an advisory vertical guidance, and it basically is not to be completely trusted. Especially in the simulator, I've noticed that it brings me down usually way too low, way too early. So while it is available, at least right now, I wouldn't recommend relying on it because it could get you into some dangerous situations. Now that I'm turning to final, I've put my gear down and I can see in front of me the runway. It's a bit further out. And this is going to all happen very quickly, but I'm also going to get my first notch of flaps down. All right, we're now about 2 miles out from the airport, and I've slowed down to 120 knots. I'm going to pull down full flaps, 100% flaps. It looks like the glide path approach mode has also been activated. I can see the runway in the distance, and it's got some trees in front of it, which I'm going to have to dodge. And we also have a 16-knot crosswind. So as I get towards the runway, I'm going to keep slowing down and try to get down to this little green dot on the airspeed indicator. This is provided by the Garmin for our approach speed. And then this is the flight path vector, and that shows us how our plane is moving through the air. This is really important to look at when you have strong winds, because while we might be pointed a little bit to the right, the path through the air and over the ground is actually where that little green crosshair is pointed. So when you have strong winds, I recommend using that and keep it pointed at that threshold of the runway as best you can. I'm going to keep pulling down our airspeed here, and as I get closer and closer, I'm realizing that there are 2 trees right in front of the runway, blocking the runway. So this is not a typical approach. We wouldn't expect these trees to be here, so I'm going to have to land very long, and I'm now adding a ton of power as I see those trees, trying to get over them and make sure that we don't clip them. So I'm going to land definitely further than the landing point on the runway. Luckily, the Vision Jet has extremely powerful brakes, so we can land with like half the distance of this runway and stop in time. So I'm fighting this crosswind, keeping my eye on the flight path vector, and trying to descend fast enough where I can land and not run out of runway. So now I'm using a bit of left rudder to correct here and try to straighten out. And as I touch down, you can see the plane pull really hard to the right. I'm doing really hard left rudder here to stay on the runway, barely. This is a very sketchy landing. And now I'll just apply the brakes. Remember, they're very strong. A little bit of braking will go a long way. And now I'll go back to the top menu and bring up the mission steps just to make sure that it's got us looking for the hold short point, which is way behind me. The Vision Jet also has really good turning radius, so I'm going to go ahead and make a U-turn here on the runway and go to that hold short point. Something I forgot to do on final because it was kind of chaotic and I was worrying about the trees was to turn off the flight director. This is something you can bind a key to as well, but turning off the flight director for these non-precision approaches, meaning not doing an ILS approach or an RNAV approach that has really good vertical guidance, it's a good idea to turn off the flight director to clean up the MFD so there are less things on it. It's less distracting. That'll make it easier to see things like that flight path vector, that little green crosshair I used. Now that I pulled off the runway, I'm going to turn off the probe heat. I'm going to get my flaps all the way up to 0. And we're going to make our way over to the parking spot, which it's now past this tower that's in the middle of the taxiway here, if it's even a taxiway. So I'm just going to try to go around and then maybe just use the Alt-N button to skip to shutdown. And now that we're done and I'm over here at parking, we're just going to shut the plane down. To do that, just go back over here and turn the run off switch into the off position, and then hit the engine start stop button, and the engine will start powering down. Then we can turn off the bleed air, the master oxygen, our lights, generators, and eventually the batteries. All right, and I got mission success just when the engine powered off before I could turn the batteries off. All right, so that was a little bit of a chaotic landing there. I was not expecting the trees. I wasn't expecting a strong crosswind, but you know, sometimes that happens. So I hope you'd enjoyed that little bit of chaos at the end with that landing, and that you got a good overview of how to use the visual approaches, how to use VNAV for our descent, and then get fully configured to land. Remember that you can use the visual approaches at any runway in the entire database, which means the entire world. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 3 of how to fly the VisionJet.